Happy to be here with you guys. Thank you all for coming this morning, for getting up early and for coming to this session and for what you do day in and day out in healthcare. Important work that you do. We're going to talk about that work and particularly about the team that does the work of HTM programs. You'll hear a lot about teams. Speaking of teams, anybody a baseball fan or sports fan, which team is the reigning Major League Baseball World Series champion? Clue, yes, we're in the home city, right? The Houston Astros. Yep. So we're not talking about justifying your department and all that goes into that, and what is HTM and how to get more support for HTM and more resources necessarily for HTM as a whole. We're really trying to focus on specific roles, in particular the roles around clinical engineers, and give you guys some suggestions on how you might grow that clinical engineering capability in your departments. Okay. Like I say, it's you're gonna hear a fair amount about baseball, and it takes a whole team to to do a good job, bring good outcomes. We're not talking about just justifying the department, and this is not just about. It certainly isn't about replacing technicians, and you'll hear us talk about that again and again through the conversation here. This is about augmenting your frontline technical service team with other capabilities and how you might go about doing that. You might have already got a good start in that direction, how you might go further in that direction. Okay. Speaking of baseball teams, you all know what a battery is, right? Or you wouldn't be in biomed, right? Baseball fans, what's another meaning for the word battery? Anybody know? A battery on a baseball team or a softball team is the pitcher-catcher combination. So full disclosure, Carol in her day was a great catcher on the softball diamond, and I was a pitcher and could bring pretty good fastballs. So together we're a battery. So if nothing else, they've learned something already, Carol, right?
Look at that.
No, another term for batteries. So check. Okay.
Save that for the next time you have to do an icebreaker.
There you go. That's right. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk a little bit about clinical engineer, and we're going to ping pong back and forth quite a bit.
Yeah.
Also, we want this to be a conversation and discussion. So if you have a question as we go, please please raise your hand or ask. If we see a puzzled look on somebody's face, we might just say, what did we say? That's not clear. Okay.
I'm a sports illiterate.
It's okay. It's mostly the team idea. So
The team, that's right.
but if you have baseball questions, feel free to ask.
There we go.
He'll answer them. So some of you in the room, I know, have seen something along the lines of this information before. But one of my gigs today, or this now in my career, is working with students. I started as a student lots of years ago, right? And my first career real job was in a hospital in St. Louis as the only frontline clinical engineer. Prior to that, and during my internship, I worked as a frontline clinical engineer in a department out in Tucson, Arizona that had, I think it was 3.5, because there was one guy that only worked half time for some reason, other clinical engineers, but they all got sucked into the artificial heart program that was booming in the mid 80s. And so I suddenly became the, hey, do you see anybody else, Carol? Yes, you're going to do this kind of clinical engineer. And so I think it's important that you know that Kurt and I have been there, done that. We've got the t-shirts, the hats, the shoes. For anything that we talk about here, we feel like it's important for you to know that we would never ask someone else to do something that we haven't done ourselves, or that we would be willing to do alongside you, right? So fast forwarding, when I left my executive job in clinical engineering, I started my own firm, And one of the things that I do is work with the University of Connecticut to recruit students into the educational program. And about 9.5 times out of 10, I need to explain the difference between a biomedical engineer and a clinical engineer, because most students are coming out of an undergrad BME type program and they've been trained to be a biomedical engineer, which is the design side, it's the development side, it's the manufacturing side, and they've had huge amount of experience with that, but they don't understand. And this is true really with any engineering discipline, is there's a flip side to that coin. Clinical engineering and biomedical engineering are really the same thing. It's just two sides to the same coin, right? On the clinical engineering side, we're the application side of biomedical engineering. We're the ones like you guys. We catch it on our side of the wall in the hospital, and then provide the feedback. Ideally, we're providing that feedback back to the biomedical engineers to improve the next rev of design and whatnot, right? Not every clinical engineer gets to do that. Some are very focused on the application in the health system. I was fortunate enough in my career to have a very intense period of time where that was almost entirely my job, was to gain feedback from frontline, my personal experience, my colleagues, and then feed it directly back to the manufacturers to influence next gen designs and development. So this is something a lot of folks don't know, because I think some of our, Brian Hawkins did a podcast, a nice podcast talking about biomedical engineers, did a good job of describing that. But it's hard to really understand this application side unless you've sort of seen it and experienced it. So hopefully today, Kurt and I can share a little bit as we go through the kinds of things where we've done these activities and make it a little more tangible in terms of how you can use the resource inside your own organization.
So I'll relate a little bit of my kind of career journey as we talk to this slide a little bit. Like Carol, way back in the day when I started in clinical engineering, and the vast majority of my career was with Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA. I started a VA hospital in New Orleans. I was a staff biomedical engineer. One of the first assignments that I got was to key into this brand new computer system we now know as CMMSs, all of the equipment information that we had at that medical center. I can tell you the technical team was very happy to have this lowly engineer there doing all that keyboarding and keystroking. For me, it was a great way to learn about the equipment that I really had very little familiarization with, and I learned which manufacturers make what type of equipment, and when you put in 220 infusion pumps, you kind of get a pretty good idea of that make and model infusion pump. And the other thing that I did when I didn't know what something was, what's a hyfricator? I grab one of the guys and they tell me what a hyfricator is. Come here, let's walk down to dermatology and we'll show you what a hyfricator is. But that kind of activity with the data systems among the functions of a clinical engineer, right? I went from that VA Medical Center after about a year to the VA Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland, where I was now a supervisor, team of about 10, 11 people. Again, I was the only clinical engineer there at the time. Those days was very much about maintenance management. So service contracts, deciding what to do, to outsource on a service contract, what to do ourselves, get the training and the resources needed to do a good job in-house on what we were going to do. Also had the opportunity there to contribute to the design and equipping a brand new medical center. That was very exciting for me. And working with the medical clinical staff to select new equipment and then to manage the installation of that equipment in a brand new VA Medical Center in downtown Baltimore. That was kind of my introduction to project management, equipment lifecycle management. What devices maybe could we bring from the old hospital to the new hospital? What needs to be replaced? What do we replace it with, right? Then I moved after 5 or 6 years at that facility to Minneapolis, Minnesota VA Medical Center. At the time, I was the only biomedical engineer in the department. The department was 2 to 3 times larger than the one that I came from, a more complex facility, had clinical services like open heart surgery, radiation oncology, technologies I had not yet experienced. So that was what drew me there, was a greater challenge. There we were able to build out, because we were getting a lot more into root cause analyses, technical design analysis, looking at the patient care environment and how do we enhance this environment for the veterans that were coming into our medical center. We built out the clinical engineering capability, and in a few years we had 2 or 3 more clinical engineers on the team at that point. So it gives you a flavoring for the kinds of activities that a clinical engineer does. And as Carol said, we've kind of lived and breathed this through our career. After some years at the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis, I went to a regional office and then to VA's corporate office out of Washington, D.C. And for about a decade, I had the privilege of leading the VA healthcare's systems, healthcare technology management program. So 170 hospitals, $9 billion worth of equipment and technology. And we'll talk maybe more about this later, but when I first was landed in that role, VA had about 95 clinical engineers across the 170 hospital system. When I left a decade later, there were 350 clinical engineers, and that was a year and a half ago, and now that's up to 400. So the momentum continues with building on that clinical engineering capability inside of VA. And VA is certainly not the only healthcare or delivery organization that makes high use of clinical engineers, but there's a heck of a lot of momentum inside of VA.
Yeah, before we change the slide, a couple of examples while Kurt was talking came to mind around the forensic analysis. When I left St. Louis, I took a job, believe it or not, some of you guys know this, I worked for a GPO for almost 16 years as a clinical engineer and supporting them, one of like 3, I think. But one of the projects I will probably never forget, some of you will recall the Baxter colleague and the screamers, right? And one of the projects was to just hound Baxter and work through finding out, it was a form of forensic analysis. It was find out what this problem is, right? Hound them, stay on them, use your engineering skills to weed through all of the marketing mumbo jumbo and the smoke and the mirrors and find the problem, right? And while I don't remember all the specific details, one of my clinical engineer colleagues and I spent probably a year really hammering through that. And we were able to push back. Now, by that point in time, the colleague was too far gone to save the patient, so to speak. But it really felt good because we were able to make a real impact on a product that was just not serving the community, that was making all of you guys that were out in the field at that time, frontline workers and whatnot, it was making your life miserable, not to mention the nurses and the patients, right? And then fast forward again to when I was in my last gig with Kaiser Permanente. I had a team of clinical engineers who had to do very similar things, unfortunately, again, with fusion pumps. But the clinical engineers really dug in, while the technician staff was frantically trying to keep these things up and running. They were working hand in hand with our clinical engineer staff to figure the root cause, because we knew we weren't getting the full story. We knew that there were challenges back at OEM headquarters and whatnot, but it was really, really important, obviously, for delivery of care for us to work together and find the root cause. So sometimes forensic engineering isn't always about that, there was a patient death, an incident, that's probably the thing we're most familiar with. But there's other forms of these activities. That was almost a blend of the reliability and the forensic that we had to do together to make a change in terms of products.
Right. It's also important to us that we not leave the message that this is the exclusive domain of clinical engineers.
Right.
Certainly there are technicians, supervisors, managers, other players that are doing some of this work through the course of your program management and your activities.
So just a quick sidebar here for those of you that were with me for the Excellence is an Accidental session last fall. What we're going to talk about going forward from here, really, you can give another click. falls in the people. So we talked about creating a roadmap, a strategic plan to build your program and design and build your program. We're going to be focused on the people part here. And ideally that people part impacts positively the other three, okay? You may remember this slide. This is like, you do your first high level assessments and then we talk about deep dives. Go ahead and click. That's where we're going to focus. That's where this clinical engineer is going to drive value for you once you've done your initial sort of program assessment, got your high level game plan, right? This is where we're going to dig in. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's keep building our roadmap, right? So everything that I talked about last fall, same premise. We got to collect data and analyze it. We're going to have to calculate the savings that we can then use to justify an allocation in our request to have this position, right? So it's the same premise that we used before. But a couple of resources I want to give you right here and now, because you're probably saying, well, how much do these things cost, right? Like if I'm going to go to the clinical engineer store, how much do they cost? Well, a colleague of ours out in Southern California back in 2020, he started this work before the pandemic, but published it in early 2020. Anyone that's interested, this is the only salary survey that I am aware of specific to clinical engineers. And he was kind enough, he was solving his own problem, but he was kind enough to share with the larger community. I am happy to share that and his contact info with you because he's incredibly passionate about this as well. That's the range. Sorry, guys, it's stupid wide, right? It is a function of geography. It's a function of job responsibilities. It's a function of a whole sorts of things, right? So it is a really wide range. I think in general, you can say entry level and a very cost effective, low cost of living sort of play is at the bottom. And the higher end is going to be your more experienced and the higher market cost sorts of areas. The report goes into clearly a lot more detail than that, but I felt compelled to give you some sort of a range so you knew kind of like what this resource is. Okay, let's keep moving. So I think what we're going to talk about now is really how do I cost justify? All you guys have become really competent at how do I justify my technician staff. So Kurt and I want to use that model or that concept and give you some ideas about how to cost justify. And don't worry, we are definitely going to get into the how do you tell the quality story as well all along. So how about it, Kurt?
You take these next couple.
Oh, you want me to take these?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So service contracts. Typically, we're familiar with using these to fund technicians, right? So we look at what's the cost of service contract. We set some targets. When I work with my clients now, I have them consider what's a target, what's a reasonable, and using some of the rules of thumb that we have in the community about related to our cost of service ratio and whatnot. Is this a biomed device? Is this an imaging device? Is it a lab device? What is it? Kind of use those numbers to tighten up. And then I'm like, now if you were going to be really aggressive, what would that number be, right? And so a lot of that has to do with their risk, your risk, you make those decisions, right? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that how many of you are managers in here and do this work yourself? Okay. What if you had somebody that did this for you so you could go do your manager job, right? So, I mean, if you've got somebody that understands the business, understands the technology, is good at data analytics, and understands the financial aspects. No, this is like any other employee. If this is, one of the folks that just graduated and is just starting, there's a little coaching that has to go along here. But if you have somebody that can do this job for you, it might be worth using part of the service contract savings of your next evaluation to fund a clinical engineer to do this for you moving forward, right? I've done single manufacturer, the portfolio you have from a single manufacturer would more than fund sometimes the savings. Now, you guys are all probably got your stuff under control, but I work with some folks that don't. And that savings that we find would more than fund a tech and an engineer, right? So look at that, because this is a way to sort of, it's like anything else. This is a capital resource for you, right? You've got to do an investment to bring this resource into your organization. And this may be one of the most straightforward for you to do because you're already doing this activity, you understand how this works, and for your organization to accept your request because they're familiar with this idea of optimizing or eliminating service contracts. So a good place to start. The other thing I want to reiterate, hours back to you as a manager, right? I know from my manager days, I'm like, when do I get to do the strategic thing? When do I get to think, right? Much less do strategy. How do I build that engagement, right? We've been in some sessions yesterday talking about building relationships with a C-suite. If you're doing all this analytical work, you don't have time, you don't have the opportunity to go until you're asking for something, right? Wouldn't it be nice to build those relationships and you're not asking for anything? I'm just here to tell you or ask you what you need, kind of thing, right? Okay, next idea, AEM. Anybody doing AEMs in here? All right, pretty much a data analytics nightmare. That doesn't take up much of your management time, does it? Like all day, every day? Same thing, right? If you've invested in that using those service contract ideas, if you've invested, now you've got somebody that can go dig deep into that data. Think back to the slide Kurt was talking about with reliability and cleanliness of data and all those things you have to do before you ever get to AEM, right? Making sure your database is ready to go, making sure you got the standardization in there you need, making sure that the text. I have an intern right now in the program that's working. They'd love to do AEM, but they're having to do a lot of rebuild in how data is entered, and so they're creating job aids. And they're making the changes in the database so that they can then have the repository that's useful to do these analytics and whatnot. Prior to that, it was pretty much the manager, maybe a lead tech who was like, you want me to do this and a full PM load and correctives? I hate to say it, I've been in organizations where I'm talking to the manager, director, who's saying, I just don't understand why they just don't get it. They're not committed. And I talk to the staff and I'm sorry, these are grown men and women in tears. Like, I'm doing everything I can. I have a full PM load. Here's my corrective. Here's the correctives that are waiting for me. And they want me to do this project. Oh, no, wait, they want me to do these 3 projects. It's just, that's not good management. And that's terrible leadership, right? So getting the right players on the field to do this work as a team collaboratively, because I can promise you to do the AEM, this clinical engineer is not doing it in a vacuum. If they are, you need to coach them up, or move them out, because this is a collaborative. They need to understand how all the other players on the field, the BMEDs, the imaging engineers, if you've got lab techs, whatnot, need to understand how all that's happening. And they can also make that connection for you with the clinical side. Recently heard from actually a couple of my clients, that as they built out their MEMP and or their AEM, they didn't get full class, or not citations, but what's the word the Joint Commission does? Anyway, you know what I mean. They didn't get dinged, but they got like a warning letter that said, if you don't engage your clinical leaders and get at a minimum their support and endorsement of this, no bueno. Going forward, when we come back, we better see that, right? So the clinical engineer can be building that, or at least building the foundation so you as the manager can have that conversation all along the way. Yes? Mm-hmm. So yes and no. I'm not going to deep dive into AEM today, but my colleague Matt Baratich, who literally wrote this book, okay, and I totally agree with Matt's point of view here, is that we could look at mean time between failures of all of, for all the correctives, all failures. But if you narrow down to those failure types that are actually related to, if I had done a better, different PM procedure or frequency, this failure would not have occurred, that's the data that directly impacts your ability to have an AEM, because now you're going to change what or how often you do. Yeah, because those other things aren't going to change the reliability of the device per a PM. You have to fix that a different way. Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Next question. Yes, sir.
They come out there, this time it's taught to them, or does it come in and now the bomb manager or the director has to work with them and teach them how to.
What's my typical answer? It depends. It depends. So if someone coming right out of school has had an internship, they have, at least out of the UConn program, my guess is many of them have at a minimum been exposed to it. We do, and we have courses that at least expose them to what the regulations are and options and whatnot. But like any new person, they can spell AEM. Some of them will have a much deeper understanding because that's one of the projects they're working on for their director. Others may just have peripheral fringe sort of understanding of it. Somebody that's been in a hospital, it's the same thing. It depends, because even in my practice, I find hospitals that have a no risk policy, and you might as well get out of healthcare if that's your perspective, but they just don't even want to know about AEM, and so anybody that works for them probably knows very little, if anything, about it. So yeah. That's okay. If you find somebody you like and you want to work with, well, Matt will mentor them. I just volunteered Matt. He's in Canada. He can't get me right now. Well, there's our next presentation. I mean, and that's actually a really good point. And one of these things, like when I was a young clinical engineer, when I was at Barnes, and I had been to AMI, I did my first AMI presentation when I was a grad student, had great support from my mentors. But my boss at Barnes said, you don't go if you don't present, right? And so I was constantly looking for a problem. It was a really bizarre, now I can look back and go, well, that was a really clever motivational thing for me. He didn't have to give me work. I went and found it, right? So, these sorts of things, these educational things, use your clinical engineer as a marketing tool as well, and a celebrating tool. Like, here's the things we did. Give them the task of how do we educate our surveyor when they come in, right? How do we educate our administration about what a surveyor would be looking for? Use them for these sort of jobs. I know I do a lot of work with the interns just in terms of my role, helping them develop speaking skills and writing skills and talking the language of other people, right? Like if you had to explain this to a CFO, you're telling the same story to the CFO, the nursing director, and your biomed staff. How would you do that, right? Thinking about those other ways. So yeah, you can use them as a translator service sometimes too.
Two comments before we move on from this slide. One around AEM. I might be different than many, but I always like to point out in the context of AEMs that AEMs is not just about reducing PM steps, right? Sometimes we're adding a step or two or three to the PMs. So it's right sizing the PMs. And if you have a surveyor comes in and you've got a good example of an AEM where you've added a step or two to what the manufacturer recommends, whip that out. Start with that as an example of our AEM program and how it works. You've won that guy or gal over right away because you're going above and beyond with the manufacturers, at least in some aspect of that procedure, right?
When it's needed.
Right.
Correct.
No,
when it's needed and
yeah.
the data supports it.
Yeah.
But I bet most of you have something that you've seen that the manufacturer didn't say do this, but you find that it helps.
Yep.
Or you're doing it more frequently. You're cleaning the filter every other month instead of twice a year because it's the lint is getting all over it in the ICU environment, right? Point that out. That's now part of your process.
How do you explain the very quick way the clinical person about AEM? Because
that's another whole.
say some device, it's part of the AEM. clinical staff and nurse and doctor starts speaking up, saying that, oh, you're not doing any PMs on this. How can you have this, put it on a patient? So how do you explain a clinical person?
You want to take it?
Go ahead.
Well, one, I think that's a whole nother presentation, almost a workshop sort of thing. But I would say that I think your clinical engineer sits down and talks to them. Our clinician partners are very data driven. Think about the systems that we put up for them, right? They're full of data. They're doing all sorts of data analysis in their heads because our biomedical colleagues are still trying to get a clinical decision support system pulled together, right? So they're very analytical people to begin with. If we just go in and say, I'm not doing it, then I'm going to be upset too, right? It's a data-driven conversation. Again, one that if you are building an AEM program, you don't come to them at the end and say, I'm not doing this. You start them at the beginning with you and say, here's what we're going to go explore. That's, to me, the short answer, and a great job for your clinical engineer to initiate. You, the manager, your clinical engineer, sit down, have that initial conversation, and then the clinical engineer continues to go back and forth with here's what we're seeing, here's what we're thinking, to make sure that we're not missing something clinical.
Know your process and relate your process. That's got all that data behind it, and your professional judgment. And as I've said to a couple of doctors before, you know, you give me a clean bill of health today, I walk out of here, is that a guarantee that I'm not going to have a heart palpitations tomorrow, right? Some of these, you know, maintenance steps just don't add value to the operation. The other thing I want to mention, because Carol mentioned not good management, I'd submit that often the overworked manager, because you're doing so much, it's born from the ethos of this occupation. You know, rarely have we seen a biomedical technician, a clinical engineer, an HTMer who's not supremely dedicated to the mission, right? To take care of patients. We'll do anything to make sure that the technology is available for patient care, and takes on a little more work, takes on a little more work, takes on a little more work, to the point that they're overwhelmed, right? And that's part of the theme that we want to get across here is, as you start getting more overwhelmed, or you see people in your groups becoming more overwhelmed, that's indication that you need to look at your team. You need to assess your team composition, and perhaps you need to augment it with clinical engineers and or other resources. So equipment strategic planning, again, another area where clinical engineers typically get very deeply into. Identifying the state of the technology in a healthcare delivery organization. You know, how new is it? How old is it? How is it utilized? It's not all about equipment age. Maybe there's technology that's rarely utilized or utilized 8 to 5. That's different than technology that's used 24/7, right? 365 days a year. Advocate for the technology plans. Work with the medical staff, work with the supply chain people, work with the finance people, et cetera, to put together the strategic planning processes, work with the other executives. This is a core function of clinical engineers. You're aligning the HTM resources accordingly. Again, the net of all of this will be returning some resources to the HTM team, because clinical engineer or engineers are now deep diving on this process, are now replacing technology before it becomes a recurring failure and a time drag on the team, right? So there's dollars to return, there's resource to return as the clinical engineer builds out these plans.
Yeah, I'll share an example. When I worked for the GPO, and that's where I first started doing consulting work, a lot of it was this. In fact, probably 90% of the consulting work I did was helping health systems build 5-year plans, and for it to become part of there. Not that I went back every year to do this, but the one thing that my colleague and I used to tell them, and I traveled and worked with, as I like to call her, my recovering imaging director friend. She managed imaging departments and was a tech for many years. And we would tell our hospital clients, look, if we find one ultrasound that you don't have to replace, you've paid for us. You've paid for us. And we'll find a lot more than that for you, right? Or at least defer it. You don't have to buy it this year. Here's when you really should think about buying it. But we're going to give you the heads up for that. this sort of savings, whether it's actual savings, what I call hard savings, which means your CFO is going to spend less than what they spend today, or soft savings, cost avoidance, where it's something I see in the future, but I'm not going to have to pay. If I can give you some nice combination of that, you will more than pay for me being here and working for you. The same thing would apply in your program. If you have somebody doing this work, they will pay for themselves year after year by keeping this updated.
You also have the perspective, a unique perspective in the hospital, that you're supporting all departments, right?
Yeah.
So radiology may be asking for X number of blood pressure monitors, right? Nursing's asking for blood pressure monitors, surgery's asking for blood. You see this and you put it all together and you get the economy of scale, efficiency of saving. Or we're going to buy blood pressure monitors for the entire hospital 2 years from now. So let's hold off till then and then buy it all together. Or if it's a priority, buy it sooner than that. So leverage that unique perspective that you have by supporting all those clinical departments. This relates to site planning, site readiness, right? Project management. We know that a change order, if you make it early enough in the process, it's not as expensive as later in the process, right? If you're building a house and the builder's all set and got the windows up, and then the homeowner comes in and said, I want that window over on this wall. You got to go backwards before you can go forwards. So that's what we're trying to point out here. You've done the equipment strategic planning process. You've been involved in the acquisition of the equipment. Your team, when I say you, the clinical engineers understand the infrastructure requirements and are helping to manage the readiness, the site preparation for that technology to roll it out, and making decisions early in the process. What am I leaving out, Carol?
I'll just give two examples. One from a consulting engagement where the hospital used, and this was back in my premier days, a hospital used a third party. Now I'm not saying don't use third parties. There are some fabulous third-party equipment planning firms that typically get pulled in by your architect firm for a construction project. First thing is, I'll say as a manager, make sure you get the opportunity to have that interview and talk with them and see who's on your project and how they do equipment planning and all of that, so that they take advantage of whatever resources you've already developed along the way here. Because I worked with this health system. We went in, another one of my colleagues, this was my, she hasn't really recovered. She's still doing supply chain and SPD. But we went in to look at this program, and this was, and we all have this person somewhere in our profession. This was a very lazy equipment planner who basically took, I guess, a project that they had already finished, and it was a completely wrong patient monitoring system. And I don't remember which was which. It was like, it was a Philips house and they were speccing GE or vice versa, whatever it was. I mean, it was completely wrong. They had clearly never talked. When I was at Barnes, I actually fulfilled this role, and I like tell my interns, I did this back before you had all these fancy cool tools. I did it with my colored pencils, got a new box every Christmas from my boss. But there were times that I sat down with the engineer on the project, and he had it wrong when it came to, I mean, the electrical systems, that all got checked and double checked by other people. But when he tried to put our clinical systems in, or low voltage systems and things like that, they were just wrong. And I would be up all night redoing the drawings, right? And those were difficult conversations. But then this idea of, had we let that go, the cost would have been, I don't even know what would have happened, right? I mean, the project cost would have completely spiraled. So having a good equipment planner, whether that's you're retained through your architect or it's a job you give to your in-house clinical engineer, can literally save millions of dollars. That's a cost avoidance thing, right? That's the last thing you want to go tell your CFO, is that you have a change order that's going to require them to, require us to take the entire ceiling out and rerun. Yeah, you don't want to have that conversation.
I don't know, how many times have we said if people would just talk to each other? Right? In a hospital, one department would talk to another department, talk to another department. We only knew this technology was being considered, or worse yet, it's on the loading dock and now you've got to install it, right? You know, clinical engineers are conduits. They're liaisoning between all of these departments, talking to each other, right? And making sure that people are in sync and communicating and working together, rallying around the rollout of a house-wide, you know, physiologic monitoring system. You know, you've got the intensivist, you've got the ED, you've got the anesthesiology, cardiology, nursing, everybody involved, making sure that they're all involved. These days, right, you can't do a lot without having, you know, network attached. So you need the IT people to have the network there and ready for when needed, and the equipment needs to be assessed for cyber risks, right, before you plug it into that network, before you buy it, ideally, right? So this is a critical function and a role of clinical engineers. Briefing executive leadership, right? How's the technology going? How's the new implementation of XYZ rolling out? Again, house-wide infusion pumps, new MRI scanner. How is that going? Oh, by the way, you may not have even heard about it. We just did this last month. You know, let's celebrate that we put this new MRI scanner in our institution smoothly, quietly, effectively, you know, not easily. Not going to say it wasn't a lot of work, but have an open house in radiology, right? Clinical engineers can help make these things happen, right? Critiquing and capturing lessons learned along the way so that we do it better next time. Not everything goes perfectly smooth as silk. Why did it not? We dropped the ball here. We forgot to include nursing education in the process. We need to remember to bring them in sooner next time around. Okay? Again, the theme here is returning hours, right? For all this clinical engineer time spent, many institutions, you know, who is coordinating the implementation of a new electrophysiology lab? And some administrator in cardiology, right? Maybe it's a cardiologist, right? Free them of that time, right? Now you're turning time back to the medical staff or the director of radiology, right? They can be focusing on patient care activities, knowing that clinical engineering, HTM, is managing these implementations, is on it, is handling everything related to that. Certainly they're involved, they're a key stakeholder, they're coming to meetings, they need to make sure that their needs are being represented so that you can deliver and meet those needs. Okay. Go back to our baseball game, baseball team, right? We're not talking here about the awesome on-field talent that most of you have today. You know, and we know that a second baseman has typically a different physique, different skill set than a first baseman, right? If you avoid that second baseman today, you know, the guy or gal who does, you know, basic biomedical service, and you've got the person who does imaging, you know, you've got a void that you need to address separate from what we're talking about here, augmenting with clinical engineers. But assuming you've got a good team of on-field technical specialists, your imaging guys and gals, your biomedical, your lab, your systems, right? We're talking about augmenting that team. We're not talking about working harder. We've already talked about, you know, we have this propensity to take on more work and to do, you know, work harder and okay, I can get more done. I'll stay an extra hour tonight. I'll come in early tomorrow morning, forget my lunch. I'll have a working lunch because I have to get this laser ready for surgery before tomorrow morning. You know, there's hardly a week that passes where your team isn't, you know, all out efforts to make sure that those clinical operations are happening, right? So you guys are working absolutely as hard in your teams as you need to. It's about augmenting the team. Think about the, you know, the back office staff on a baseball club, right? You've got a general manager dealing with all the contracts, right? Guys on the field aren't worried about, you know, who's, except for maybe their own, when it comes time to renew a contract, but, you know, what's the contract of, you know, of my teammates? What's it look like? You know, what are we outsourcing? They've got scouts, right? Who's finding your talent for you? Who's spending time with human resources, making sure that recruitment announcements accurately reflect what you're looking for, so you get some applicants that are highly qualified and selectable to you, right? How about analytics? If you know Moneyball, the movie, it's all about the analytics that came into the sport of baseball, right? And that optimizes the team's performance by positioning the outfielders, because the batters have a propensity to hit in the right field corner, right? So move over towards right field outfielders, right? Those outfielders wouldn't know that without the analytics and the analysis that's been done behind that, right? Back to our AEM, right? We've got people that are doing the analytics to right size the maintenance, as an example, right? So these are the, the off field, not necessarily front line people that are racing to, to make sure the technology is operational and available for clinical care, but the folks that are making sure that those people that do that work day in and day out are doing it as effectively and efficiently as possible, right? Ticket sales and baseball club, if they don't have fans coming to their games, then, then they're a financially losing organization, right? We don't often think of sales inside HTM, but we need people who are really good with customers, with executives, describing the work of HTM and how important it is. So, it's a flavoring of sales.
And I would just build on that and say, selling the ideas that come out of this. You got to sell the idea of a service contract optimization. You got to sell the idea of an AEM. You got to sell the idea of a capital plan, right? Everything we do, I wish I'd figured this out earlier in my career, right? It's not. There's a little bit about selling my own credibility. There's a lot of demonstrating my on-field credibility, but I have to be able to sell these ideas and show that my ideas have credibility. You can trust me as a clinical engineer, as the manager, whatnot. And it's because I have the right people on my team, right, to do that. So yeah, it's truly complementary. It's about building the right team. It's about having teammates that you can trust and rely on, whether you're the manager or the new tech that just walked in the door yesterday. And it's working collaboratively, just like a team. Kurt and I talked a lot about, because when I wasn't catching, I was typically playing second base. And if you don't know and trust your shortstop, turning a double play, it turns into a complete cluster, right? If you don't know how to do that and you don't know each other's jobs. I can't do their job. Well, they asked me to do it in old lady softball, and that was a disaster. But you know what their job is. You understand their job. You appreciate the nuances of it. And so you tailor your own job to do a match, so that what you deliver is people just go, wow, look at that, right? So I think we've rounded it out. Should we go to questions?
Yeah.
Comments,
Questions,
experiences?
yeah.
Was this helpful? Cool. Cool. All right, look, we did something. Yeah.
Score, yes, yes. Again, often we see a situation where, okay, leadership says, okay, you can have a clinical engineer, but, always fearful of that but, instead of your supervisory technician, right? Instead of another position, right? And we have to break that mold, right? On occasion, maybe a near-term step is to, okay, get the clinical engineer in the door, right? And maybe you have to sacrifice another position in the near term, knowing that that clinical engineer is going to lay out a strategic plan and build the business case for more staff over time.
Yeah.
But this is not about replacing technicians with clinical engineers.
And I want to dispel another myth that's out there, or at least not universal truth, which is clinical engineers just want to be managers. It's not true. It's not true. Personally, I worked as a staff engineer for many years, and then I've been a manager, responsible for people on 3 occasions. I have anything but a straight line career. When I was at Barnes, my first management opportunity was with a bunch of folks that we would today probably call desktop support from IT. It was in the day when IT was born into the hospital, because quite frankly, nobody else wanted them. I was psyched. I'm like, this is a whole new thing. Back to that whole inquisitive idea of, engineers finding problems to solve. I did that for a while and said, I'm tired. I want to go be an engineer again. And so I did. I went back and was an engineer for a while and learned new things and got new skills, and then had an opportunity to manage engineers, other clinical engineers. And that was a different experience that I did for a while, and then said, do this anymore, I'm exhausted. And I went back to being an engineer, and then ultimately ended up in a totally unexpected executive role, which was fascinating, learned a ton of things, but I am thoroughly enjoying being a clinical engineer again, right? So I think that myth has been out there for many, many decades that when we come out of school, we just want to manage. And that's not true. We thrive on working side by side with our technician colleagues and our nursing and physician, and we thrive on being in the middle of all of that. And if duty calls and you need us to manage people, just like interview us to death. Make sure we're people friendly. We try, we really try. But just like technicians, not all of us are meant for managing people, and not all of us are meant to manage people forever, for extended periods, right? So I guess this is we're just like everybody else speech.
With one exception, you might want to not let us too close to the equipment itself.
Oh yeah, that's very true.
With our screwdrivers.
Yeah, no, that is true. The techs made me take one step back from the bench and put my hands behind. I would troubleshoot with them because my vision of it was at a system level. Like, how is this across an entire department or across an entire hospital? But if you ask me to get down to the circuit level, as they said, Carol, you let the magic out. Just smokes. So yes, some of us are not tool friendly either.